All right, so this morning we just reviewed, earlier we just reviewed two things. First, we learned that you can create classes in JavaScript, and it's pretty similar to when I create classes in Python. And then we also reviewed JavaScript interacting with HTML, right? So we built that little clicker app where I clicked a button and it updated a counter for us. Which is ultimately what we're going to do with React. But it's going to take us a little bit to get there as we talk about how React works. So React is actually a library of a bunch of functions and it just, what is the word I'm trying to think of? It's a library of a bunch of functions, right? But it takes a lot to set up a React app, right? So originally when you had to set up a React app, you had to use something called Webpack, which we won't go into super detail about. And then you needed an interpreter called Babel, because not all browsers can read the new modern JavaScript. So there's something called Babel that will read modern JavaScript and then convert it into older JavaScript that the browser can read. All of this is just general knowledge that you'll need. You don't need to memorize any of this. Anyway, it used to be really hard to set up. So Facebook created React, and when they created it and released it, it got popular pretty quick. One of the complaints was it takes so long to set up, and there's a huge learning curve just to set it up. So what people wanted and what they eventually released was something very similar to our Django admin start app, right? So when we do Django admin start app, it kind of builds out a directory for us, and it links up a bunch of files for us. It gives us some settings. And thankfully, we also have that with React. So Facebook released this thing called Create React App. So when we install, I'm at my desktop here. Everybody see that? We're not going to be here for that long. But so I'm going to be on my desktop. So when we install a package in Python, we use pip, right? That's our package manager. The package manager for JavaScript is called, there's a couple, but the one we're going to use and the main one is called NPM, Node Package Manager is what it stands for. And it allows us to download different packages, right? There is an update to NPM called NPX, which is sort of the newer version, which we can also use. The NPM will still work, and we're still going to use NPM in some cases. But what you're going to want to do to get started with React is do npx install, oh my god, install create React app. So you'll do that first, right? What did I do wrong? Cool, create React app. I'm not going to do that because it's going to take forever, and I already did it. So that'll take a bit when you do that. After I've installed Create React App, I can tell it to make a new React app for me. So I'm going to do npx create React app, and then I just name it whatever I want, right?
Great.
Is this like when you do Django admin start?
Exactly.
Project,
Yep.
Or is it like start app?
Just there's no distinction between apps and projects with React. So you can just think of it as project. It's just going to make the whole React project for us. Okay. Yeah, there's not really a distinction between those two things with React.
So they're
It's
all
just
apps.
yeah, just one big app.
Oh, they're not separate apps.
Not the way we're going to do it right now.
Do we need to get into a virtual environment? And
Nope.
Also, can you do that?
JavaScript does not have virtual environments built in, but so we do virtual environments with Python. The language has that venv built in. There are other ways to do virtual environments. One very popular one is called Docker, and that is a really helpful thing later down the line. But for us right now, it's not going to matter, and I'll show you why in a minute. Why we're not going to have versions collide, because NPM deals with versions of things a little bit differently. So I'll show you that in a second. So I'm going to do create React app, and we'll just call it counter, because that's what we're going to build. And it's going to take a little bit, but so you can see the file popped up here on my desktop over here. You can kind of see it. And it's going to download everything we need and then build out the base React app for us so that we don't have to do any of that. But it takes a little bit, and I'll show you why in a second.
Would you have multiple React apps for a website?
You might, but like it depends on what you're doing.
A simple web app.
You would have one project. Yeah. Okay, cool. So it built everything out for us. You can go through and see the commands it ran and all the things it downloaded. And it says happy hacking. So now I have counter right here. So I'm going to open that in VS Code. And I'm going to shrink this a little bit. Can you still see that? Okay. So we'll take a little tour of everything. So this is everything it gives us, right? So the first thing I'll show you is node modules. So when JavaScript and NPM deals with packages, they download the whole package. The whole package gets downloaded, and it gets put in this node modules folder automatically. So even if I wanted, so I did this with React, and React requires all of this stuff to run. You can see there's tons of stuff in here. You won't ever have to go in this file unless you're just curious to see source code. There's no reason to go into this file, but you can see it's huge, right? Because it has a lot of dependencies. If I download more stuff, like if I want my React app to use any other node package, when I do npm install, npm is smart enough to automatically put it in this node packages folder, node modules folder, and if it doesn't exist, it'll create it, right? That's exactly why we don't need VNV, because all the stuff I need for this thing to run is right here, right?
Is it already on the part 2?
It should be in the git ignore. Yeah, because you don't want to push that folder up because it's enormous. You'll see too when you delete, like I've had tons of React apps on my computer just from doing lessons over and over and over again. I had maybe 10, and I deleted them, and it took like a full 5 minutes to delete them because there's so much stuff in these node packages, that's why you don't want to push it to GitHub. So now you're hopefully asking, like, well, if I push my project to GitHub, how do people know what dependencies there are? NPM also creates this thing called package.json. This is kind of like your settings file, right? You can think of this as settings in Django. And it's a giant JavaScript object, JSON object, and it has a bunch of information, settings about our app, including all of our dependencies are listed here. It has some scripts. So these scripts are like when we would do manage.py run server, manage.py migrate, right? These are the scripts that we have. And right now we have, we don't need to really worry about these right now.
So when you install something that your project's going to be, it goes to node modules automatically, you said, and then it'll also add, well, I mean, then but does it also automatically add to package?
Absolutely, yes. And so that's the thing. So if I delete, actually, this is a little, I'm pretty sure this will work. If I delete this node modules folder, and then I go into my command line and I do npm install, and I'm in a place with a package JSON, because I'm in a file with a package JSON, npm knows to read that, and it'll go back and reinstall everything for me. It'll read it out of the package JSON, right? Now this is going to take forever, so I regret it completely, but that's how that works. So while this is doing, we can keep walking through the directory. And we should see the node modules folder pop up here when it's done. See, there it is. So it popped it up and it's still installing. Cool. So that's, if you pull down a React app, the first thing you want to do is do npm install. It'll automatically install the dependencies for you, and it reads them from the package JSON. So as long as you're in the same directory as the package JSON, it'll know. If you do it outside, it'll get confused.
And it adds it to the package.
Yes, if it's not already there. Yeah. Cool. So that's our node modules. These are all our dependencies. So then let's walk back down to public. This is where all like the public-facing assets go, our fav icon, this index.html, which we'll talk about in a second, another like settings folder or file. Go ahead. Yes and yes. I'm gonna say yes. We usually do not do much in the public folder. Usually that's just there as the entry point to our app. What's up? Yeah, so static is anything that we're just delivering as is. So if we think about it from Django's point of view. So if we're on Django, any of the CSS we write, any of the JavaScript we write, Django doesn't have to do anything to like render that or fix that or make that work. It just sends that whole CSS file. It sends that whole JavaScript file as is. Images are static because we don't alter images. We just send them to the client. So anything that doesn't need to get messed with. Not static stuff would be like our templates, because before we send them to the user, we have to like run a bunch of Python inside the template and then send it. So those are dynamic, right? They're not just as is. They might change depending on the request, right? But static is just like I write it once and it just gets sent, right? So the public folder, again, we don't do much in here. The thing I want to point to is index.html. This is the entry point to our app, right? This is kind of where everything starts. So this file will get loaded first, and there's really nothing in it except some meta tags. If I wanted to bring in some fonts or something, I could do it here. Other outside stuff, any CDNs I want to put in. You notice this div root. This div is where our entire app gets loaded, right? So that's public. We don't do much in there. Source I'll come back to. That's basically the whole app. We know what get ignore is. Package lock is, what is this? This is just another list of our dependencies, I think. This is just a more robust. I'm gonna have to look into like what exactly is the difference between these. I think this is saving like versions specifically. And this is, yeah, I know. I'm gonna get back to you on when this, I thought I understood this, but then when it showed up after I did that, I was like, okay, I'm gonna have to come back to that. Just know that these both handle keeping track of our dependencies. The README is just a README, and then yarn lock we don't need to talk about. Yarn is another, it's like an alternate to NPM, but we're not gonna use it. So it's here because a lot of people use it, but we don't need to worry about it right now. There might be other modules that use yarn. That might be why that's here. But it's the same as this package JSON. It's just you can do yarn install stuff too. But we're using NPM, so don't worry too much about it. Okay, so that's just kind of, that's all like the under the hood stuff. We won't really touch any of that stuff that much, right? But it's good to know what it does. Most of our app, most of the work we will do will be in this SRC folder, this source folder, right? So if I open this, we can see a bunch of other stuff. How do I get rid of this? Oh my God. How do things work? Okay. So our source folder has all the CSS for our app is here. There's not much in it right now. App.js. This is the container for the whole app, right? So everything kind of gets rendered inside of this app.js. Which then gets, okay, so let's see. App.js is like the beginning of our app. Then there's this index.js, which does this React DOM render app. This thing right here, app, is this function. This will make more sense when we start doing it, but I'm just trying to give you a tour. You see this get element by ID? So it's grabbing the element by ID root, which we saw in index.html. So it's grabbing this div, and it's inserting that function app, right? And that function app returns this div with this header, and there's an image in here. This is all set up by default, right? That, I think, is all we need to know about that for now. Cool. Are there questions so far? Once we start building this out, I think it'll make more sense once we see it run. Okay.
Is there like you said it's where everything happens?
Yeah.
Like what would be like
the Django equivalent?
yeah.
There really is
Okay.
isn't
Just
one.
making sure.
Maybe, yeah. Like your your like main template kind of. But hopefully this will make more sense as we build it out. Okay, so when we create a React app by default, it just builds this out, and we can do npm start that's our run server. npm start is our run server. So I'm going to do that. Cool, and it started, and then let me pull this over here. It actually opened it in the browser automatically. And so this is our base React app. Cool. So this is like your whatever blank screen or whatever. Okay, let me go back to my notes, which were here. Okay, so now we're going to use React to build our counter, right? We're going to build the counter thing that we built this morning, except we're going to do it in React. So React works on this idea of components. Has anybody done any research to this yet? Understand or try to give us an idea of what components are? What we mean by a component? Not yet. Oh, go ahead, Jed.
Good. All right. Well, I think it's something like maybe even something like an app bingo, where it's just like
Yeah.
specific feature. Like a shopping cart.
Yeah, so it is a little bit like an app in Django, right? What it is it's a reusable chunk of code. And the reusable part is what's so important and what makes React different, right? So once I write a component, I can then kind of call instances of that component over and over and over again in my app wherever I need it, right? So when we think about like chunks of, let's see if I go to like Instagram. Oh man, is there any way to see Instagram without having Instagram?
Go to Yelp. That's a good one.
Okay, cool. Yeah, thank you. Yelp is good. So with Yelp here, you can see I have these like cards, if we remember from like Bootstrap, right? So like this is a whole section. This is a whole section for a review. You can see that these three things are extremely similar, right? They all have a photo on top. They all have a name here. They all list the stars. It's just the specific data that's different, right? So in React, these would all be instances of the same kind of component. Let's just call it a card component for right now. So you would define a card component, kind of like you would define a class, right? And then you could tell React, load the card component with the information like, 4 stars, load the card component with this image and the restaurant being Sumi, I guess, etc. Does that kind of make sense? So the same structure, different data is what we talk about with a component, okay? So now, just to add even more confusion to it, there are 2 types of components that you can use. And this is a recent thing with JavaScript, with React, that we are also learning ourselves. It just happened, I think, a few months ago, that you can do these 2 types of components. So we'll use both of them today, and then you'll get practice with them as we keep going. So the first type of component is what React loads for us. This is the new one, and it loads it for us by default. It's called a functional component. You can see this is just a function called app, and it returns this all this HTML, right? So it's just one function, and it returns HTML. But this actually isn't HTML. This is something called JSX, which is equivalent to Jinja. What was Jinja in Python? What? It is a library. It is a library. What does it allow us to do? Run Python in HTML. JSX, same thing. Looks just like HTML, but we can run JavaScript in it, right? We're not doing that yet, but we can. But it's just important to know that this isn't straight up HTML. It's JSX, that we can run JavaScript in. We'll see that in a minute. I know that this is like a fire hose of information. All of this is in today's write-up, and when you do it yourselves, it'll help. But please ask as many questions as you want along the way. So let's build our counter. So I'm going to delete all of this. And we don't need the logo anymore.
You don't have to import that. It's part of React.
This is all built in when we use create React app. So that's one of the things, like if we didn't have create React app, we'd have to set it up ourselves and it would be very annoying.
I meant the JSX.
Yes, yeah, no, that's what I mean.
Oh.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Like the JSX isn't part of React. It's its own thing that when we write React, it's just common to use it. And when we do create React app, it brings JSX in for us. Cool. So what do I need here for my button? I need an H1. And we can say count. And we'll just start with 0. And then here I'm going to do button. And click me. Cool. Let's reload. Let's come back over here. Cool. So we have a button and a click. Is this like, yeah, I'm on 150%. That's good. Okay. So it doesn't do anything yet, right? Not super helpful. Each React component has this idea, this thing called state. Anybody know what state is? Or what does it sound like it might be? Take a wild guess. Nick. It's not a fair question. Yeah. Yeah, totally. So you got it. You did it. You should always go with your gut. It's data that that the component will keep track of, right? So it's kind of, I don't want you to make this one-to-one comparison, but it's kind of like our instance variables, right? These are the variables connected to the React component. And they're all kept in something called state. So instead of having like instead of just making a, right? I actually have a larger object called state, and it's an object, and then it has a bunch of key value pairs. So in this case, it would be count 0, like that. And then if I had another one that was just like, I don't know, like name, if we were keeping track of someone's name, it would be like that. And then I would get at all these variables by doing state.count, etc., right? So the way we keep track of state, so we have to keep track of state in 2 different ways depending on the kind of component we're using. In this component, in a functional component like this, we do this. Okay, so what is going on here? So I had to, we're importing React up at the top. I also imported a function that React has called useState. And when I have a functional component, this is like my road, this is my connection to state, right? This function, this specific function. Whenever I run useState, I pass it an initial value for that state. In our counter, we want it to be 0. We want it to start at 0, right? useState is a function. You can see we're calling it just like a function, and functions return things, right? And we can save the things that they return to variables. We've done that before. When we did new person in the other example, which I deleted, we saved it to the variable Josh, right? So new person returns an object, we save it to Josh. useState returns 2 things, which is new to us, right? Returns 2 things, And we can set both of those things to variables with this syntax. That's what this syntax means. It says take the first thing that it returns, set it to a variable called count. Take the second thing it returns and set it to a variable called set count, right? So what are these things? Questions about that?
So you right now, it's underneath that state.count, like print state.count and tell you 0.
Yes. So let's actually test that theory.
Is it user state or use state?
It's just count. Yeah, user. Sorry, it is use state. I am stupid. Thank you. It is use state. Appreciate that. I could see how that would be extremely confusing. Sorry. It is use state. So if we do this, this is very new to me too. So let's see. It printed 0 right here, right? So now count is available in this function, right? And it's 0.
So what is set count?
Well, yeah, so that's my next thing. Great question. So what the hell is set count? So when we deal with state, and this is true across all of React, when we deal with state, it's like the law of React. You do not directly change state. You use a function to do it. So you would not want to do. I wonder if it'll even let me do this. Let's see. I would not want. So count is 0 because that's what I set it to here. If I did count equals cool, we rerun this, it explodes. Assignment to constant variable. Wait, what did it? Oh, it's because I said count. I wonder if I do that. I'm really just like playing with fire here. I have no idea if any of this. It does work. You're not supposed to be able to do that. I'm so confused. All right. All right. I'm not sure why that works yet. We're still learning. But the preferred way would be to use this function,
So
right?
set count makes it a constant.
No. So count is our variable now. Is our state variable set to 0. The other thing use state returns is a special function for altering that variable, right? So anytime now in my app that I want to change count, and I have no idea why it lets me do it, but it shouldn't, or I don't know. Anytime I want to change count, I now have this new function that use state returned for me and set to set. And I can call it whatever I want, but it makes sense to call it set count, right? So now I have set count.
So that use state automatically.
Yes, so use state gives me the variable and it builds the function for me. Cool? And it sets them both to these.
Do you use set count?
Yeah, so now what I should be able to do is say set count hello like that. Come back. React limits the number of renders, infinite loop. Is it because I'm not doing it in the turn? I think because this is running so many times. Yeah, we got to wrap this in a function. All right, we're going to get to set count in a second. We'll get to set count in a second. Okay, so, sorry, one thing at a time. We'll come back to set count. So now I have this variable and I have this function. Now I want to use my count variable. So down here, instead of hard coding 0, I can say count. And so these brackets are just like when we would do double brackets in Jinja to evaluate something. We can just use single brackets to evaluate a variable in JSX. Cool so far?
Do you need the spaces?
No, but it just looks nicer. But no, I don't think so. So now we're going to come back here. We still have 0. Let's just confirm that it's doing what we want to do. 7, come back here, and it's 7. Cool? Okay. So now the next thing we want to do is when we click this button, we want it to increase, right? So let's bring this back to 0. Undo. And we're going to write a function to do that. So we're going to do, let's see, this morning. I'm going to write a fat arrow function called handle click equals and I'm going to say set count to count plus 1. And then on the button itself, I'm going to say on click equals handle click. Exactly. So what I'm saying here is, let's walk it down. First, I'm creating a variable called count, and I'm also creating a function so that I can update that variable, right? Then I'm writing my own function, just a regular fat arrow function that we've written before. In that, whenever this handle click gets called, it calls set count, and it resets count to count plus 1. Cool. So remember, like set count will set to whatever we pass it. So it'll do count plus 1, and then it'll go into set count, and it will reset my count variable. Cool. Down here in my return, so what does my function actually return? It returns a div, and inside of that div is an h1 that is evaluating the value of the count variable. And then on 14, I have a button. Now here, this is a little different. I'm putting this is same as like add event listener, but I'm putting it directly on the button. And I do that by saying on click equals, and then pass it the function that I want to run, right? So far, so good? You can see I'm not invoking this function because then it will just run immediately. What I'm saying is, remember we talked about this the other day where we were passing Django functions, right? In our URLs, we said like views dot blah, blah, blah. We passed that whole function in. Same idea here. I'm just passing the function in, but it's not getting called until someone clicks the button.
So do you need those brackets for that?
I'm pretty sure you do because we're putting JavaScript in there. Let's see if this madness works. All right, sweet, we did it. Cool. So we built the same thing, but we built it in React. How's everybody feeling so far?
Can I see it again?
So far, so good?
I'm confused as to how the count is actually keeping track of how it's acting as an accumulator rather than just running once and then. So when
Go ahead,
the
yeah.
function handle click runs,
Right.
it increases, so it's like 0 plus 1. So
Now count.
is
Now,
1, and then it goes.
Because it's a state variable?
yeah.
Or, I mean, that's-
Let me try it. Let me see if I can answer that. Let's start again here. Let's refresh this. So now count is 0, right? That's what we initialize it up here, right? As 0. Once I click this, my handle click event fires, right? It takes count, which was 0, adds 1 to it, and then runs set count to reset the count variable. So that now it's reset to 1, right? Come back over here, the same loop happens. The reason it's not getting reset on 5 is because like this whole app function is not rerunning every time, just the handle click, right? So the app function runs once, does line 5, and it establishes this handle click and attaches it to the button, which now for all time, while this is loaded, will keep track of the state. Cool. I think some of this will be cleared up for you. Actually, now, this being the first time I taught it, realized this should be the second thing I teach you. Because now I'm going to teach you the other way to make a component, actually the old, I don't know if it's the old way, we're still going to use it, which maybe will clear some of this up for you because it doesn't abstract as much away from you, okay? So that's one way. This is the one way to do it. Now, let's say my actual goal for this app is I want 100 counters on my page, and I want each one to keep track of how many times it's been clicked. That's my ultimate goal, right? So there are a bunch of different ways I could have done this in regular JavaScript, but we'll show you how to do it in React. And also, they will finally, I think, illustrate the power of React, which I think right now we're just like, cool, we did the exact same thing and wrote like 400 billion lines more of code. I don't understand why we're doing this, right? Okay, so I'm going to actually pull some of this logic out and put it into a class component, which is the second kind of component. So app.js will always be here. Usually in a React app, you're going to have a bunch of components. And there's sort of just like a standard kind of industry file, or this is one kind of way to organize your files that we're going to use. So in source, I'm going to make a new folder, and I'm going to call it components. And then in components, I'm going to make a new folder. I'm going to call this button. And then inside of button, I'm going to make a file called button.js. Cool. Go down here. In button.js, I'm going to import React, and I'm going to import something called component. And then I'm going to make a class component. And this looks like what we did at the very beginning of lecture. So it's class button. Yeah, I should call it component. It extends component. If I'm making a class, this is just my class. I call whatever I want, but I'm going to call it button component. It extends React's component class. So it gains all this functionality from the React class, right? Automatically. I can do a constructor here, but we don't really need to right now, so I'm not going to. What we really need is state. We need to keep track of state. Yeah, it's like the init. Yeah. We can keep track of state by just saying state equals, and then count 0. Every single component that you create, it doesn't have to have a state variable if it doesn't need one, but it must have one thing, and that is a render function, a function called render. So I'm going to make that function right here. And what render is ultimately after all is said and done, what gets displayed, right? It's the same as our return over here, right? But when we have a class component, we separate it out into a function called render. Render also has a return. It returns something just like a function. If I want to return something that's more than one line, I have to wrap it in parentheses. And then what I want this to return is actually, I'm going to pull out everything that we did here, put it into button. I think that's what I want. Count, click. That looks good. Let's go back over to app.js. Let's delete these. Yeah, I'm gonna get. We need one here, right? Okay. And then the last thing I need to do is write the handle click function. So handle click. Bless you. Thank you. Okay. So what has to happen when I click the button? It has to call handle click, and then what do I want handle click to do? Increase my count. So now I'm going to add a bunch. We're going to do the same thing, but I have to add a bunch of new syntax because of the nature of how these class components work. So in a class component, whenever I want a variable that's inside state, I can't just say count anymore. That's not going to work in a class. I have to say this dot state dot count. So this is what? Yeah, it's like self. So like it's like eventually we're gonna make a bunch of instances of this button component, and each one will keep track of its own state, and each one will have a count attached to that state. That's what we're saying here. So we have to say this dot state dot count, and then also down here I have to say this dot handle click, and then in handle click, and I no longer have that set count, right? That doesn't exist for me anymore. What I do need to do is say this dot set state. So this is so in the functional one, every time I create a variable, I get my own special function to update that variable. That's in a functional component. In a class component, I have this kind of catch-all function that can update any of the state variables for me, and it's called setState. And again, I do not want to do .state.count equals 1, right? I don't want to do that directly. That's just not what we do. So we say setState. State is what? It's just an object, right? So I have to pass setState an object, and I just say count, and I reset it to count plus, this.state.count plus 1. All right, that was an enormous amount of stuff. Anybody have any questions right now? Yeah, go ahead, Andy.
Do you have to import set state, or does React just know?
Pretty sure that comes from extending components. So it's up there somewhere, it gets pulled down.
So, question.
Yeah.
So, pass an object to set state, and it automatically goes to state. So, do we have to absolutely call that object state along the top?
Yes, this has to be called state.
Oh, okay.
Yes, it has to be called state. Okay, there's one thing that I'm missing, which is
Then why do
the,
we need this? What's interesting?
go ahead, Bobby, what's your question?
What is the point of this page right here? What I see is handling the click and it's setting the count. Is that just, it's just what we did?
It's exactly, so far it's exactly what we did in the other one, but we've pulled that out and we've done two things. We've pulled it into its own component and we've used a different type of component called a class component, which is the more traditional kind of component.
What was the component of
A functional, I believe, a functional component, because it's literally just a function.
And you can use either of these and they'll both work.
Yes. Yes.
So we can definitely use the second one. First one.
Yes.
Cool.
The first one, the second one, I think makes a little. It makes a little bit more sense, I think, compared to what we did before. But these are just they're gonna get more widely used in the coming as React develops, right? I just like have a feeling that that's where they're leaning. So we need to introduce them to you. But like most of our curriculum right now, because it's based on what React was doing before a few months ago, are going to be class-based. Okay, but you should know both. Okay, so now I've written this, but if I look at my app, there's nothing on it, right? Because right now the only thing getting loaded is this app, and it's just returning an empty div. So there's nothing here. So what I need to do is import my button and start using it, right? Start making instances of it. Now, a couple of things about how imports work with React. You can see that they very frustratingly flip it. Instead of from blank import, it's import this from React, right? So get used to that. The other thing that's annoying, or not annoying, I don't know, it depends on who you ask. It's much more declarative. So is if I write this function and I want to be able to use it other places, at the bottom, I need to say export default, which just says I want this to be able to be read from other files. Cool. So that needs to be at the bottom as well. So I've set all that up. So now I can go into app.js and I can say import button component from, and then I just need to give it the path, which is slash components slash button slash button. Cool. So now I have my button component here. The way I instantiate, I guess, a component, the syntax for it looks a little bit like HTML. Just like that. Cool?
So now you create the button in another file, and now you just import this file.
You got it. Yep, 100%. And so this should work as before. There it is. There we go. Very, very cool, right? Not really. But what I can do now is this. So now I have a bunch of these, and each one will keep track of its own state. Right? So this is finally kind of the magic of React we're starting to see it, right? I can even do things like, so now I have this, but if I wanted 100 of these, I wouldn't want to copy and paste this 100 times. It's so much repeated code, right? So up here, I could say const buttons equals, wait, what do I want to do here? I'm just going to do it this longhand way so we can see it. I'm going to make an empty array. I'm going to say for let I, you remember our for loops? Yeah. I will review, so map and for each, there's these other methods. I will review those later, but I just want us to very clearly see what we can, how this is working. So while I is less than, let's say 100, and then we'll do I plus plus. So this should run 100 times, or 99 times, which is fine. And for each time it runs, I want to do buttons.push, which is like append in Python. And I want to just put a button component in there. Then I can delete all these. And then just render buttons. Okay. So when this file loads, it'll import button component. When this app function runs, it'll create an empty array called buttons. It will then run a for loop 99 times, and each time it will append a button component to this array. Something kind of cool about this JSX is if I have an array of components, I can just throw the array in there, right? So I didn't have to do anything else. I just throw this array, which has 99 button components inside of it. I can just throw the whole array in here. And then when we come back and load this, we have all of these. Make sense? And then again, each one will keep track of its own state. Whew, that was quite a bit. I think that's all I have for now. And ask me any questions. Throw them at me now, if you have any.
For the files, I noticed that you capitalized some of the first letters. Why is that?
It's a great question. It's just a convention. I'm not really sure why it got adopted, but that's the convention in React is any component, I capitalize the file name.
When you imported into the app.js, you didn't put .js at the end. That doesn't matter.
Yeah, that's implied.
Okay.
I think it'll still work if I do it. Yeah. So you don't have to. Narayan and then Nick.
We went over the functional components and the class base. Okay, so what cases will we use functional versus?
Yeah, that's a good question. My understanding of it right now, and this is evolving as John and I keep trying to learn this stuff, is React has something called lifecycle methods that we have not gotten to yet. But if you need these lifecycle methods, as far as I know right now, you're going to use a class for that. Otherwise, you can just use the functional one. So again, like when we get to those, which I think is in 2 days, that might make more sense. Nick and then Nick and then.
For doing things functionally, we want to run the function. We do the same way we do it, but class have a file that we call.
Yep. Yeah, if we made button a functional component instead, I'm pretty sure we'd import it and create it the same way. We probably wouldn't have to change anything in here. I'm like 90% sure. Other questions?
When is, you guys said that there's an actual person who does React Disabled X
Tomorrow. He'll be able to answer a lot more of these questions, hopefully. Including, Narayan, you should ask him that question tomorrow, because he'll probably have a better idea.
The styling, is that just already come?
Yeah, this was our, like, you can alter this if you want in here, and then you just import it into the file. Same thing here. If I wanted styles for button, the convention for that would be in this. That's why I make a folder for it, because in this folder I would do, then I could write all my CSS in here, and then here I would do, or that how they did it here?
And then that would,
And then I could target any of the stuff here with CSS.
and that would automatically, would that overwrite what you have for the app?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, because CSS reads like it cascades down, right? So I would, all my app level stuff would be in app, and then individual stuff for each component I would put in the file or in the folder, like that. So yeah, it's very nice because everything is like compartmentalized, right? So all the CSS for this component it's all right there in the same place. Any other questions? Did you have a question? No? Okay.
If you wanted to do, in the first way we had it with the functional component 99 times. Somebody asked this.
No.
Okay. Like, would you have to copy and paste that in 99 times? Or I guess you could just create the array the same way?
Yeah. Cool. I know it's a lot. It's really like the more you work with it, the more it'll start to make sense. We have the challenges for today are pretty good at just getting your feet wet. So please first run through what I did, okay? So that you can get the button working and you can follow the video if you need to. Then there is there are 3 things today. I don't remember what detention is. What is detention?
It's just print phrase.
Okay, that sounds doable. And then Palindrome, you're going to take in text. I think try to you're going to take in text, and I think it's like as it's being typed in, you're going to return whether or not it's a palindrome. So you're going to like react to every key press kind of. I'm pretty sure that is what this one is, just skimming it. And then state abbreviator. This one's a little bit more difficult. So what is this one? Let's continue. State data. Oh, you're going to get this state data, and people are going to enter what state they want. And you're going to show them the abbreviation for it. I'm sure that's what this one is. So the ones that you're writing now, you're not going to be using a ton of components. It's really just to get you started with more like this type of stuff where like I'm writing a function that's reacting to the HTML that's being returned. Cool. I don't know why I recorded all that.